On the afternoon of September 7th, 1982, a small group of fishermen docked in a small, isolated Alaskan town named Craig noticed smoke coming from a harbor about 1 mile away. Residents began to look upon the fire in the distance as a couple of ships went out to investigate, eventually learning that the smoke was coming from a 58-foot fishing vessel named the Investor, which had quietly left Craig's port a little over 1 day prior. Having anchored in a quiet cove near Fish Egg Island, the Investor had been uncomfortably silent since leaving the small town. It was believed that all 4 crew members, as well as the family of the ship's owner, were still on board, but a full accounting would take weeks to conduct due to the damage that had already been done by the time emergency crews responded that evening and managed to quell the flames. In total, 8 people had perished in the tragedy, of whom only 4 would be positively identified. Ship owner Mark Colthurst, his pregnant wife Irene, their 5-year-old daughter Kimberly, and Mark's cousin/deckhand Mike Stewart. Another deckhand, Jerome Keown, would be identified through partial dental records, but the other 3 assumed dead in the blaze. Deckhands Chris Heyman and Dean Moon, as well as Mark and Irene's 4-year-old son, John, were assumed dead. Investigators theorized that the blaze, which had raged for the better part of an entire day, had destroyed their remains almost entirely, leaving behind nothing to be identified. Investigators were stumped in the aftermath of this senseless crime, learning that at least 2 of the victims, Mark and Irene Colthurst, had been shot in the head prior to the fire. They would remain the only 2 victims whose cause of death could be determined. Because Irene was still wearing the dress that she had been wearing at dinner from the night of the alleged murder, September 5th, it was believed that the victims had been killed shortly after returning to their ship. Perhaps the killer had waited for each of the victims to return to the Investor, killing them in small groups throughout the night. However, because the fire had successfully destroyed most of the evidence left aboard the ship, as well as the ship itself, there was very little for investigators to piece back together. Over the next 2 years, the investigative body overseeing this case, the Alaska State Troopers, would continue to follow up on it, following leads as far away as Washington, specifically in the Bellingham area, where most of the victims had been from. This was an area that was rife with other commercial fishermen and women, those that were involved in the same social circles as the victims, and many of whom had been in the region of Craig, Alaska on the night of the murders. This would eventually lead to the arrest of a suspect in September of 1984. 24-year-old John Kenneth Peel, who lived in the Bellingham area, had been in Craig on the night of the murders, and had a personal connection to many of the victims. Even though the arrest of John Peele came with a lot of pomp and circumstance, with detectives and prosecutors hailing their 3-pronged case as airtight, it came just days after the 2-year anniversary of the crime, and just weeks after authorities had stated that they were narrowing down their investigation to a single suspect, but had no physical evidence to pursue that case. Nonetheless, the arrest would make headlines nationwide, as it seemed like resolution was close at hand for the largest murder case in Alaskan history. But the case presented by prosecutors over the next several years would reveal large gaps in the narrative that they were weaving, leaving behind several questions which remain unanswered to this day. This is part 2 of the Investor Murders. Despite ruling him out as a suspect early on, investigators had begun to circle around John Peele months later, when 2 separate phone calls had been received. Calling into the tip line established by authorities, at least 2 individuals told police that Peele should be investigated as a suspect in the 8 murders, due not only to him matching the suspect sketch, but him having a troubled history with the Investor's owner, Mark Colthurst. John Peele had been identified by at least 4 witnesses, who claimed to have seen him on the Investor's skiff, traveling to and from the craft in the days surrounding the murder. This included individuals from the casino, the trawler that had first noticed the fire aboard the Investor, and raced out to try and stop it. If you recall from the last episode, they had interacted with a young man heading to Craig aboard the Investor's skiff, who they spoke to very briefly. Another witness would claim that Peel was the young man seen purchasing gasoline the morning before the fire, who it was reported left Craig's dock aboard the same skiff. However, these witness sightings were not alone in building the case against John Peele. His prior relationship with the Colthurst family, in particular Mark, the owner and skipper of the Investor, was reported upon heavily in the weeks after Peele's arrest. In addition to once dating Mark's sister, a tumultuous relationship that apparently carried on and off for approximately 3 years. John Peele had been a prior crew member for Mark on another ship that he captained prior to the Investor, but he had reportedly been fired the year prior for alleged alcohol and drug abuse, which was said to have permanently soured the relationship between John and Mark. Peele's lawyers would argue that he had not been fired from Mark's crew, but rather decided to work aboard another ship the following year. They would argue that the two men had remained friendly in the years since, which was seemingly validated by many of the Colthurst family members, who recalled Mark and Irene purchasing a wedding gift for John Peele after his assumed dismissal from the work crew. The relationship between the two men would remain a point of contention moving forward, but prosecutors alleged that Peele held a grudge against Mark for having been fired, which, in their argument, reached a tipping point on the evening of September 5th, 1982. That night, a witness recalled seeing John Peele talking to the Colthurst family while they attended Mark's birthday dinner at Ruth Ann's restaurant in Craig, claiming that he was speaking to Mark and Irene for the better part of 10 minutes. Peele had another alleged run-in with two members of Mark's crew that evening, reportedly selling them weed, which Peele denied to authorities when questioned. While all of this information seemed to implicate Peele in the murders, or at least supplied the motive and opportunity needed to have committed the crime, it did very little to address some of the conflicting statements released by authorities in the past, or the gaps in the narrative that remained unexplained even after Peele's arrest. For starters, John Peele had no prior criminal history, nothing that indicated his ability for such careless violence, nor any kind of impulsive criminal behavior, which this murder indicated. In fact, until his arrest, Peele had been a law-abiding citizen with no real character concerns, other than smoking weed and being a little lazy. He had married his wife the year prior to the murders, and she had given birth to their first child, a son, roughly 1 year before Peele's arrest. By all indications, he was just a young man progressing into a family man, who had shown no signs of having been a vicious killer to anyone that knew him. To add on to this, several friends and family members said that it was impossible for Peele to have been the killer. This included many members of the Colthurst family, who described him as a friendly, outgoing guy with a good sense of humor, who always seemed to get along well with Mark and his crew. One of Mark's family members even described John as a real pleasant guy. Brett Randmell, one of John Peele's friends, told reporters in the wake of his arrest why he didn't even have the nerve to punch anyone. "I'd believe the Investor killer was my mother before I'd believe it was him." Additionally, despite some witnesses having identified John Peele as the suspicious man they had seen in Craig at around the time of the murders, the still unknown man in the Investor's skiff, just as many had chosen not to identify him as this individual, despite having multiple opportunities to do so. One of these men, who had seen the young man from the skiff and originally told police about his sighting, said that he had previously known John Peele and that the man from the skiff was definitely not him. Another witness that encountered the man from the skiff was shown John Peele in a photo lineup and reportedly responded, "Oh, that's John Peele. No, I know him." Other witnesses were less decisive about their conclusion, stating that while Peele could have been the guy from the skiff, they were not really sure since most of the young men in the area looked pretty similar, including Peele. A man and a woman, who had been among the first responders, racing their boat out to the flaming Investor, had been unable to pick out Peele as their suspect, despite having stopped and speaking to the man from the skiff as they raced out to the burning ship. During preliminary hearings, following John Peele's extradition to Alaska, his lawyer Philip Whitener would allege that prosecutors had intimidated multiple witnesses into testifying in front of the grand jury. This allegation, that authorities were leaning on witnesses, perhaps illegally, would come up again and again during these early hearings, causing at least 2 of the 24 witnesses to plead the fifth, claiming that they now had doubts about the testimony they had originally presented. This would allow these witnesses to avoid potential perjury charges, should it come to light that they had fabricated any part of their statements, but also began to put doubt into the minds of many that followed along with the story in the media. Peel's lawyers would also bring to light a discrepancy with the transcription of one of Peel's police interviews, which had been apparently incredibly valuable in obtaining the grand jury indictment. The transcription, submitted to the grand jury instead of the actual audio, stated that Peel had told investigators, "I'm scared, man, I'm scared. I can't believe the things I did in there." However, Peel's lawyers alleged that Peel actually stated during the interview, "I'm scared, man, I'm scared. I can't believe you all think I did that." The differences between the two were pretty striking and could have possibly influenced the grand jury into pursuing charges against him. Another discrepancy came in the form of a witness sighting, which seemed to oppose the scientific foundation of the case, which would become another hot-button issue. While John Peele had been identified as the young man getting 2.5 gallons of gas on the morning of the Investor fire, the prosecution had failed to mention to the grand jury that only white gas residue had been found at the crime scene, which hinted at the killer using a different kind of accelerant to start the fire, likely not gasoline, which would have left behind regular gas residue. White gas residue would have likely been left behind if the killer had used kerosene or some other kind of similar accelerant. This argument would seem to punch a hole right in the middle of the prosecution's scientific or forensic case. All of this information was going to be taken into account by both the defense and prosecution, as John Peel's arrest quickly became a thing of the past, and his first court date continued to loom larger and larger on the horizon. During almost all of John Peel's court proceedings, he would wear a mask or an elaborate disguise, such as a fake mustache, wigs, glasses, etc., in order to mask his appearance. His lawyers cited their client's safety, believing that Peel's privacy was at risk of being permanently violated because of the high-profile nature of the case, and would call for police to avoid talking to him as he was being transferred between buildings and jurisdictions. They would even ask for Peel to be able to avoid being photographed by members of the press, in order to avoid tampering the witness pool for his upcoming trial. The trial itself was scheduled to begin in January of 1986 and was expected to run for more than 2 months, so that the jury could hear all of the evidence both for and against his guilt, in what had become the state's largest mass murder case to date. However, before all of that could happen, preliminary hearings would have to be held to determine what evidence could be presented during the trial, as well as to establish the limits of Peel's bail. The circumstances surrounding that could become an episode of their own. During these hearings, John Peel's lawyers would file several motions alleging misconduct on behalf of the prosecution. As I hinted at just a few moments ago, it was alleged that prosecutors had intimidated witnesses, or at least misconstrued their statements, to influence jurors and convince them to file an indictment against Peel. In at least one case, Peel's lawyers argued, prosecutors had straight up falsified evidence. They were hoping to get the trial dismissed with prejudice, which would permanently bring an end to charges against Peel, but they would prove unsuccessful in that endeavor. Peel's lawyers would also ask the judge presiding over the case to resurface the now sunk Investor, which had sunk to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean about 6 miles away from Craig, while being towed back to Washington State for refitting. Peel's lawyers argued that the state allowing the hole to sink was akin to destroying the crime scene, as they were now unable to test for bullet holes, ballistics, etc., all of which could lead more conclusively to a second suspect. Philip Whitener, Peel's main attorney, argued that the defense is now in the posture of having to search the bottom of the ocean for the scene of the alleged crime. In August of 1985, during these preliminary hearings, it became apparent that the allegations from the defense were finally beginning to lead somewhere when Ketchikan Superior Court Judge Thomas Scholes chastised prosecutors for failing to present potentially absolving evidence to the grand jury, which had originally indicted John Peele. He stated that the grand jury might have carefully weighed this evidence against the incriminating evidence presented by the prosecution, but they never had the chance because prosecutors had withheld it from them, instead presenting only one side of the argument, leading to Peele's indictment. It was later learned that this potentially absolving evidence included numerous eyewitness statements from people that had seen the suspicious man on the skiff leaving the crime scene, but had purposefully chosen not to identify John Peele as their guy immediately after the crime was reported, when their memories were fresh, railing against the prosecutors for presenting only one side of the argument against Peele. Judge Scholes proclaimed in court, "What the hell conclusion am I supposed to draw? On those facts, do you know of any other conclusion a layperson would draw? It's like leading a bull through a barn door with a ring in his nose. It's a nice tight inference that was suggested very clearly to the grand jury." Towards the end of that summer, the end of August 1985, Judge Thomas Scholes agreed to dismiss the charges against John Peele without prejudice, meaning that Peele could be tried again for the same charges, but not under the current set of circumstances. Prosecutors would have to refile their charges and start back from square one. Judge Scholes stated about the prosecution's decision to withhold evidence from the grand jury. "It was a hell of a mistake. They're going to have to go back and re-indict him if they can." Despite deciding to dismiss the current case against Peele, Judge Scholes would refuse to cancel his $1.1 million bond, which had been met after a group of his friends and family members put together a real estate package of over $1 million, and held fundraisers in their local community to raise enough money to pay his $100,000 retainer. Similarly, Judge Scholes refused to validate the defense's position that prosecutors had intimidated witnesses, stating that there wasn't enough evidence to support that claim. While this decision was an overall legal victory for John Peele and his defense, it was anything but permanent, with officials quickly putting together a second round of charges against him. That October, John Peele was indicted by a second grand jury, and a new trial was ordered, set to begin on the same date that his original trial had been scheduled for. Peele would again plead innocent to all of the charges filed against him, and began to dig in alongside his lawyers, preparing for the extended legal battle that was still months away. Despite attempts by John Peele's lawyers to buy more time to prepare for their defense, the trial to decide his guilt was scheduled to start on January 13th, 1986. Even though the trial was only expected to last upwards of 2 months, Judge Thomas Scholes told jurors to prepare for at least 4, due to the extremely large amount of evidence that was lined up to be presented, namely witnesses, many of whom lived out of state and would have to be transported to the remote area of Ketchikan by boat or plane. In time, this would result in this trial becoming the most expensive in Alaska state history, at least up until this point. Before the trial started, the defense and prosecutors began posturing in opposing measures. Peele's lawyer, Philip Wagner, who would end up representing Peele for free because he viewed the state's case as preposterous, would tell reporters, "Of the many cases that I've encountered in my career, I have never seen such serious charges brought on the basis of the weak evidence reflected by the record in this case. Although it's unfortunate that there even has to be a trial, I and Mr. Peele are looking forward to an opportunity to point out to a jury the lack of evidence and the unreliability of the state's witnesses." Prosecutors, meanwhile, were much more withholding in their public statements, having had their original case dismissed before it got to trial due to their own oversights. After that public embarrassment, they vowed not to try the case in the media. As the trial commenced, the prosecution began to paint a picture of an employee seeking revenge against the person that had fired him from his lucrative position. They began to portray John Peele as someone that had worked with Mark Coulthurst in the past, but had been fired after the 1981 fishing season for drug and alcohol abuse. However, a year later, he ended up in the same remote town as the Coulthurst family, and decided to come aboard the Investor on the night of the murders. While there, prosecutors argued, he had likely gotten into an argument with his former friend and boss, which escalated into violence at some point that evening. After shooting and killing Mark Coulthurst and his wife Irene, Peele had then gone on to murder the couple's 2 children and Mark's 4 crewmen. Fearing that any of them would be able to identify him as the killer, he had then gone through the extensive process of attempting to scuttle the ship, but due to his unfamiliarity with the expensive new fishing vessel, he had then resorted to fire to destroy the crime scene. Afterward, he had continued to lie low with his crew, eventually returning to Washington State at the end of that fishing season, and then seeking a new career opportunity that would keep him in state for the foreseeable future. At least, that's the argument that prosecutors made through their extensive and expensive calling of witnesses throughout the trial. Some of these witnesses claimed that Peel had exhibited bizarre behavior both before and after the murders, and seemed to express knowledge about the crime that was not common knowledge. Some of these witnesses claimed that Peel had known about the victims being shot to death before September 9th, 1982, when that information was publicly released by authorities for the first time. Among these witnesses were a couple of fishing captains who claimed to have seen odd happenings around the crime scene at the time the murders were believed to have happened. This included one captain that claims to have suddenly remembered details about the night of the murders more than a month after they happened, later on in 1982. Jeff Bundy, who was the captain of the Sheila Ryan, had been in Craig on the night of the murders and had not recalled anything seeming out of the ordinary until a month or so later. He was at his home when he heard gunshots in the distance, someone target shooting, and claims that his recollection was kickstarted by the mere sound. He would tell the court that he suddenly remembered hearing a loud argument aboard the Investor on the evening of September 5th. Explaining, "Then I believe I heard shots, 6 or 8 shots, then a scream. Then I believe there were more shots. It went on for quite some time." Bundy would admit to drinking alcohol on the evening in question, and believed that he had not been dreaming, but wasn't 100% positive. Peel's lawyers would call into question his sudden recollection of these events, weeks after the fact, and disputed their validity. The other skipper brought to the witness stand was Larry Demmert Jr., the captain of the ship that John Peele was working on at the time of the murders, Libby 8. Demmert was able to provide a much more convincing argument against Peele, someone that he had employed and worked with, and had known for over a decade when the victims aboard the Investor had been killed. Demmert would tell the court that in the early morning hours of September 6th, at around 2 a.m., he was awoken. "I think I heard a woman scream. Immediately after that, I heard popping sounds, like a generator backfiring. I wasn't sure. I was real scared. I had never been that scared in my life. It was like there was danger in the air, evil in the air. It was real thick. I saw John Peele standing on the dock. It looked like he might have had a rifle in his hand." Larry Demmert said that he identified John Peele because this ominous figure was wearing the same sweatshirt and hat that Peele often wore. And he said that the only gun Peele had available to him, which was usually locked up aboard the Libby 8, had an identifiable scope on it. Demmert would then testify that John Peele had decided to fly home to Bellingham that season, instead of riding back aboard their ship. John Peele's lawyers would argue that Larry Demmert was only testifying for the prosecution to avoid getting out of unrelated drug charges that he was facing, an accusation that I cannot confirm, but he has spoken about himself, and he was grilled extensively about his prescription to Valium, which they alleged may have impaired his memory at the time of his testimony. Alice Irons, a waitress at Ruth Ann's restaurant in Craig, Alaska, had been one of the last people to see the entire Colthurst family alive on the night of the supposed murder. She testified that she had seen the entire family with John Peele just hours before they were murdered, claiming that Peele had spoken to Mark for roughly 10 minutes at some point between 8 and 9 p.m. However, when she was questioned by the defense weeks later, Irons was unable to rebut claims that she might have been confusing this encounter with another from a few months prior to that hearing, where she had encountered John Peele meeting with his lawyers at another restaurant she was working at. This back and forth between witnesses would carry on for several months, with the prosecution finally resting their case in late June, 4 months after the trial had originally started, allowing the defense to take over and present their side. The defense of John Peele took on many of the same tactics as the prosecution, calling numerous witnesses of their own that seemed to dispute many of the prosecution's witnesses. These witnesses would cast doubt on John Peele being the man from the skiff, who had been seen by multiple witnesses, not all of whom agreed upon John Peele being the guy. Joseph Waymiller, a commercial fisherman who had been in Craig in September of 1982, told the court that John Peele was not the man that he had seen, whom he had told police about shortly after authorities began responding to the fire aboard the Investor. Waymiller claimed that the man he had seen was middle-aged and stocky, perhaps of Native American origin, none of which could be used to describe John Peele, who was a tall and lanky young white man. Several of the eyewitnesses that had spoken to police in the wake of the murders, many of whom had seen the alleged man from the skiff, claimed that investigators had excessively used photos of John Peele in their photo lineups, with it being reported that 8 out of the 29 photos presented to witnesses were just different photos of John Peele. It was believed that this might have tainted the witness pool, making them more predisposed to picking out Peele as their suspect. In 7 out of these 8 photos, Peele had been wearing a baseball cap, which fit the description of the man from the skiff, who was reportedly wearing a dark baseball hat, and 3 out of the 8 were mugshot photos taken from the interrogation room in the Bellingham Police Department. A psychology professor from the University of Washington, Elizabeth Loftus, who had been called upon by numerous law enforcement agencies to testify in criminal trials, would state about this stacked photo lineup. "I would hold this up as probably one of the worst examples of a photogenic test. This is not a fair test." While the prosecution had tried to paint a picture of a wronged employee, the defense pushed back against that, presenting numerous witnesses who claimed that John Peele and Mark Colthurst had been on good terms at the time of the murders, and that they had actually gotten along and were friendly with each other. After all, Peele and Colthurst lived close to one another and belonged to the same large friend group, often interacting with each other and their families during social outings. Peele's main attorney, Philip Widener, would argue that prosecutors had built a house of cards based on nothing but speculation and inferences, which he claimed did not hold up to scrutiny. Peele's lawyers would float a theory during the trial that the murders might have been committed by a professional hitman, someone hired to carry out a hit on any of the 8 victims. When Philip Widener had the opportunity to question Sergeant Chuck Miller of the Alaska State Troopers, he would ask about a witness who had heard explosive sounds approximately once an hour for several hours early on the morning of September 6th. Isn't that consistent with someone holding the crew and executing them one by one, trying to get something from Mark Colthurst? He asked. Additionally, Widener would claim that investigators had not looked into allegations that the Investor's owner and captain, Mark Colthurst, might have been involved in international drug shipping, which he argued included a potentially large amount of cocaine, which had allegedly been transferred from the Investor to another ship within 24 hours of the murders unfolding. This drug angle seemed to conflate with the possibility of an assassin carrying out the crime, 2 angles that the defense leaned upon during the course of presenting their argument. Peele's legal team would also point to additional evidence that investigators had seemingly ignored, which related to one of the Investor's crewmen. Dean Moon had been one of the 2 deckhands that were presumed dead aboard the burnt ship, but had not been identified through any forensic link. Widener would argue that 2 witnesses had reported seeing Dean Moon in San Francisco after the murders, as recently as 1983, including one person that was previously friendly with the presumed dead deckhand. One of the other arguments presented by the defense were the allegations that Mark Colthurst, the deceased captain of the Investor, had a reputation for flying into fits of rage while drinking. This argument was bolstered by the fact that Alaska's medical examiner, Donald Rogers, had noted during his examination of Mark and Irene Colthurst's bodies that they had high blood alcohol levels pointing to impairment at the time of their deaths. But he could not say that definitively because of the damage done to their bodies by the flames. Mark had become known to become slightly argumentative while drinking, and was known to have a fiery temper at times, as many sailors do, and this was provided into the record by defense attorneys, who argued that there was just as much evidence incriminating Mark Colthurst in the murders as there was John Peele. This wasn't meant to be a derogatory statement aimed at Mark specifically, who was one of the 8 victims of this crime, but was meant to highlight the state's overwhelming lack of physical evidence, of which there was basically none. John Peele's lawyers would continue to petition the court to dismiss the charges because of alleged evidence that prosecutors had been leaning on witnesses to testify in exchange for favors. This included the allegations from 2 witnesses in Bellingham, Washington, who had reportedly asked a local attorney to step in and help protect them from overreaching prosecutors. But this would prove to do nothing to sway the judge in charge of this case. The defense would finally rest in August of 1986, after 6 weeks of refuting the state's case and pointing the blame at other potential suspects. 11 women and 5 men had been selected to the jury pool in January of 1986, and were told from the get-go that 4 among them would be eliminated during the trial, before reaching the deliberation phase. Eventually, the jury would be comprised of 9 women and 3 men, none of whom were sequestered throughout the trial, but were encouraged to refrain from discussing the case with anyone. These jurors would spend the better part of 1986 observing the trial, not breaking to deliberate until late August, nearly 7 months after the trial had originally started. Over the span of roughly 25 weeks, they had viewed more than 800 pieces of evidence, including more than 150 witnesses, almost all of whom had to be flown or shipped to the remote location of the trial at the state's expense. The total cost of the trial was estimated to be about $2 million, which is a steep price to pay for justice that would never quite be found. On Thursday, August 28, 1986, following 6 days of deliberation, the jury would inform Judge Thomas Scholes that they had been unable to come to a consensus regarding John Peele's fate. The jury had re-listened to several dozen hours of testimony during this span, but none of it had helped to clear up the points of contention between them. One member of the jury would later tell reporters that they had been leaning in favor of acquittal, primarily being split 7-5 in favor of a not guilty verdict, but leaning towards 9-3 on certain counts, but had been unable to come to a consensus after nearly an entire week of deliberating, resulting in a hung jury. This would bring the longest and most expensive trial in Alaska state history to a very unceremonious end, but did nothing to clear up the fate of John Peele, who had been 22 years old at the time of the murders, 24 at the time of his arrest, and was now 26, approaching 27, and had yet to be found guilty or not guilty in Alaska's most notorious mass murder. The first indictment had been dismissed before trial, and the state's most recent attempt had now resulted in a mistrial, neither of which allowed the case to be dismissed outright. The case was again punted back to the state, who weighed whether or not to pursue charges against John Peele for the third time. After spending nearly 4 years and several $1 million doing just that, they would spend several weeks contemplating their decision, before deciding in October of 1986 to bring John Peele to trial yet again. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Today's episode is also brought to you by BetterHelp. Is there something that interferes with your happiness or is preventing you from achieving your goals? If so, BetterHelp Online Counseling is here for you. Through BetterHelp, you can connect with a professional counselor in a safe and private online environment, which is incredibly convenient, especially for those of us having to live in the age of COVID. You can get help on your own time and at your own pace, and you can schedule secure video or phone sessions with your therapist, plus chat and text options. Anything you share is confidential, and you could speak to licensed professional counselors that specialize in anything you might be dealing with at the moment. If you are not happy with your counselor, you can request a new one at any time, for no additional charge. Thousands of therapists are available worldwide, at any time, and you can start communicating with them in under 24 hours. Best of all, BetterHelp is a truly affordable option. Unresolved listeners can now get 10% off of their first month with the discount code UNRESOLVed. So, why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/unresolved, fill out the questionnaire, and let BetterHelp assess your needs. Once again, that's at betterhelp.com/unresolved. Now, let's return to the show. While the second trial of John Peele was originally scheduled to begin in the early months of 1987, that timetable would come into question when Ketchikan Superior Court Judge Thomas Scholes was removed from the case, after it came to light that one of his law clerks had struck up a post-trial relationship with one of Peele's lawyers, creating a conflict of interest. This would ultimately lead to several delays throughout the year, and the trial was not officially scheduled to make way until mid-November, more than 5 years after the murders themselves, and more than 3 years after John Peele had been originally arrested. In order to help save on the extravagant cost seen in the first trial, approximately $2 million, the trial was moved from Ketchikan to Alaska's capital, Juneau. There, preliminary hearings and jury selection would begin that November, but the prosecution would not start presenting their case until January of 1988. in what was sure to be another lengthy endeavor due to a brand new jury having to hear the case and all of its witnesses for the first time. The state's case in Peel's retrial would unfold very similarly to how it had in the first, with the prosecution presenting an argument built around numerous witness statements, almost all of which put Peel in or around the crime scene and the victims in the time period that the murders were reportedly carried out. This included statements from several people that had spoken to Peel in the weeks surrounding the crime, testifying again to his bizarre behavior and statements made, which, when read out during court hearings, seemed to indicate his guilt. Homicide and arson investigator James Stogsdill, who is a sergeant for the Alaska State Troopers, was one of the prosecution's standout witnesses in the retrial. Having worked on the case for a period of years, Stogsdill was able to detail how the suspect profile had been created by law enforcement, which ultimately led them to identifying Peel as their potential killer, who not only matched the physical description of the suspect, but was personally familiar with the victims. Stogsdill claimed that this might have compelled Peel to murder everyone aboard the Investor, including the children, because, in his words, they might be able to ID the murderer. Sergeant Stogsdill also claimed that Peel would have known how to handle the ship, quietly sailing it out into the harbor near Fish Egg Island and attempting to scuttle it, before eventually setting it on fire. He also claimed that Peel's prior relationship with Mark Colthurst and his sailing experience would have led to him having the skills required to commandeer the Investor's skiff for his own use that week. Everyone says he was driving the skiff like he knew how. The defense would push back against this assertion, stating that most people in Craig had similar knowledge of how to pilot ships and skiffs, and reiterated that John Peele had not worked on the Investor, which Mark Colthurst had just purchased earlier that year. Two brothers from Sitka, Walter and Charles Samuelson, were called to the stand to testify that John Peele had confessed to the killings while playing cribbage with them months later. According to Charles Samuelson, John looked at me and said, "I did it. I killed them." He kind of had a weird smile. However, his brother Walter would admit to Peele's lawyers during cross-examination that he thought Peele was joking during this alleged confession. The defense would also push back against the validity of these two witnesses, claiming that the state had agreed to drop unrelated drug charges against one of the brothers in exchange for their combined testimony, a claim that had now become a trend throughout both trials. While the prosecution and defense had exchanged several jabs throughout the entire process of the first trial, this confrontational attitude would reach new heights in Peel's retrial. Throughout it, both sides would seem to express antagonistic scorn towards one another, having to constantly be quieted by Judge Walter Carpenetti, who would dismiss several motions by Peel's lawyers for the case to be dismissed outright. In these motions, Philip Widener claimed that prosecutors were asking misleading questions that could end up biasing the jury, and they were doing so in order to throw the case, which he alleged they were losing. The trial continued on through April of 1988, lasting significantly shorter than the first, but still consuming several months, during which time only the prosecution chose to present witnesses, after they had rested their case, allowing the defense to finally do the same. John Peele's lawyers decided not to present any witnesses of their own, claiming that the burden of prosecution was on the state, and that they had already failed to prove John Peele's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in their own presenting of the case. As such, they argued, no defense was needed. During closing statements, Alaska State Prosecutor Mary Ann Henry would admit that investigators had been unable to determine John Peele's motive in committing these murders, and had failed to obtain necessary fingerprint matches or even the murder weapon. But she argued they ultimately did not need to. The state can't tell you why the first shot was fired. The state doesn't have to prove why. The state also doesn't have to prove how he did it, she said. In their own closing arguments, Peele's lawyers would use the prosecution's case against them, claiming that the state had no motive, no murder weapon, and, more importantly, no physical evidence. Only speculation and hearsay, which had encouraged Peele's lawyers to make a last-minute play and not present any witnesses of their own. They would also claim that the state had failed to address how Peel, a rather slight young man, who was even smaller at the time of the murders when he was just 22 years old, could have overpowered 5 men and killed all 8 of the victims aboard the Investor, a question that had not been adequately explained throughout the trial and arguably remains unexplored today. Philip Widener, Peel's attorney, would tell the court that the absence of motive can raise a reasonable doubt, and it does about this innocent man, John Kenneth Peel. After making their closing statements, the case was submitted to the 12-member jury that April, who were all instructed by the judge to either acquit Peel entirely or find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It was all or nothing for the prosecution, who had spent several years and millions of taxpayers' dollars to reach this point. By that weekend, it was announced that a decision had been made, and John K. Peel, now 27 years old, having been held in house arrest for nearly 4 years, was acquitted of all the charges filed against him. In the aftermath of this decision, Peel was advised not to answer any of the media's questions, but would release a brief statement in which he said, "It's terrible being an innocent man accused of a crime. I just thank God it's over. Justice did work this time." Philip Widener, Peel's lawyer, whose risky decision not to present any witnesses in the retrial had paid off, was much more thorough in his own statement to the press. "From the moment it was issued, I have always said the indictment was not worth the paper it was written on. I didn't put a case on because there was no need to dignify this case by putting on witnesses. The prosecutors put an innocent man and his family through this ordeal for 4 years. Widener would then hint at legal restitution for Peel and his family, who had exhausted almost all of their savings and put up their own property to procure the man's freedom over nearly half a decade, a gambit of their own that had paid off, but at an incredible cost. While the end of John Peel's second trial provided a happy ending for him and his loved ones, it was much less satisfying for the family members and friends of the Investor's 8 victims, who were still left without answers nearly a decade after the crime, long after what was left of their loved ones' charred remains had been laid to rest. Even though the state's case had proven unsuccessful, the state insisted that they had technically solved the case, but were unable to prove it in court. Mary Ann Henry, the prosecutor in the case, would tell reporters in the weeks after John Peel's acquittal, "Our system is built on the theory that it is better to let 9 guilty persons go free than convict 1 innocent man. In this case, John Peele is going free for 9 crimes. I can say that it's the state's view that we know who the killer is. It's just apparent that the state was not able to convince the jury that there was sufficient evidence of that." With her statement, the prosecutor seemed to put the onus for the case's unsolved nature onto the juries, which had failed to come to a decision in John Peel's first trial and had ultimately decided to acquit him in the second. However, in doing so, she failed to address the state's overwhelming lack of evidence, anything tangible or physical, which unfortunately might have just been due to the case itself. After all, the crime scene was a burnt-out ship that had been scuttled before the trial and was sitting on the floor of the Pacific Ocean when John Peele was acquitted. But the lack of evidence wasn't evidence itself, especially when proving someone guilty of mass murder, and it had become clear over 2.5 trials the state did not have enough evidence to prove Peele's guilt, and the results were a mistrial and acquittal. In the years that would follow this decision, the case of the Investor murders was placed on the national and even regional back burner, becoming overshadowed by more explosive and modern crime cases. However, the now acquitted John Peele would eventually move forward with his planned lawsuit, filing it in April of 1990, almost 2 years to the day of his acquittal. In this suit, Peele and his lawyers were seeking more than $150 million in damages, which would be paid out to Peele, his wife, his son, and the rest of his family, who had had to put up their own property as collateral in order to obtain Peel's bail years prior, and had nearly bankrupted themselves taking care of him during his house arrest, having been ordered by the court to supervise him day and night during the multi-year trial process. In this lawsuit, Peel also asked the state to continue their investigation, which had been centered around him for years now. However, this plea would fall on deaf ears, as state officials continued to assert that he was the killer and that they had no plans to move from that position, at least not publicly. By September of 1992, the 10-year anniversary of the case, authorities stated that they were continuing to receive tips in the case, but nothing that they learned was enough to sway them from the path they had committed to back in 1984, when they chose to pursue charges against John Peele. John Peele's lawsuit would eventually be settled in 1997 after years of back and forth between both sides, and rulings in federal court, who had to decide whether the state of Alaska had violated John Peele's civil rights during his detainment. It was ultimately revealed that the settlement was for $900,000, which was less than 1% of Peele's original asking price, but it was something, at least. Nearly 40 years after this heinous crime took place, it remains just as unsolved as ever, with the investigation seeming to have come to a standstill decades ago. While officials have reiterated their belief that John Peele was the lone killer in this case, his acquittal in 1988 remains unimpeachable, a constant reminder that even if he did commit the crime, there's nothing that authorities can do to bring him to justice for it. Prosecutors in this case have long blamed investigators for bungling the early hours of it, blaming them for allowing the investor to burn for several hours, and with it, almost all of the physical evidence. However, it seems like there was very little that authorities could have done to prevent that, barring some kind of miracle. By the time they arrived at the scene, the fire had already been burning out of control for hours, and it's hard to think of what anyone could have done differently, especially since authorities did not know that there were bodies aboard until the flames had originally been contained. It seems to me like everyone involved with this case, at least on the side of law enforcement, seems to have been playing a game of what if for decades now, wishing that they could just go back in time and do things the right way, but that's just not how life works. In cases like this, you typically only get one shot to pursue justice, and officials had 2 chances to try John Peele for the murders, and both times they came up empty, not having enough evidence to convince a jury even when the defense chose not to present a case of their own. But if John Peele did not commit this crime, and prosecutors wasted years and millions of dollars pursuing the wrong man, then that leaves behind an even scarier proposition. Perhaps the killer was not identified correctly by law enforcement. Hell, for all we know, this might not have even been a single killer, but rather a group of killers who acted in tandem to murder all 8 of the victims aboard the Investor at once. In the decades since, some have theorized that drugs might have played a larger part in this story than originally theorized, based primarily upon statements made by the defense throughout the first trial. Peele's lawyers argued that the Investor's owner, Mark Colthurst, might have been involved in drug smuggling to help pay for the $800,000 shipping vessel, and may or may not have transferred a large shipment of cocaine to another ship the day before the murders. While there has been nothing to confirm these rumors in the decades since, again, they are just rumors, they continue to linger to this day. To me at least, this theory seems more likely than a single deckhand managing to murder all 8 victims in one fell swoop, based on little more than a half-baked revenge motive. In my research for this story, I discovered at least one unique individual that lived in Craig at the time of the murders, who I am not floating as a potential killer. Trust me, that's the last thing I want to do, but rather as a possibility that law enforcement might have overlooked. Jim Leroy Robinson was the owner of Craig Auto at the time of the Investor murders, who had been one of the witnesses who had identified John Peele as the man from the skiff, claiming that Peele had purchased gasoline from him on the morning of the fire. During Peele's trials, Robinson was picked by the prosecution to testify and would become one of their most convincing witnesses, claiming that it was definitively John Peele who had purchased the accelerant the morning of the fire. However, it would come to light after Peele's second trial that Robinson was not who he said he was. Jim Leroy Robinson was actually Kenneth Harvey Robertson, a convicted arsonist with a history of violent crime, who had been wanted in the state of Arizona since June of 1981 when he escaped from a halfway house with more than 4 years remaining in his sentence for burning an unoccupied structure. After fleeing Arizona, Robertson had ended up settling in the area of Craig, Alaska, thousands of miles away from prying eyes, and there he ended up adopting the name of Jim Robinson as a pseudonym. While living there in Craig, he would become embroiled in the entire investor saga, becoming a star witness for the prosecution. His true identity would not be learned until years later, after the defense began asking questions about the validity of each witness, and realizing that Robertson's backstory was rather void of any substance. It was then learned that Kenneth Harvey Robertson, as he was legally known, also had a history of making violent threats against women in his life, many of whom he had threatened to kill with firearms and explosives, and whose vehicles he had physically torched in the past. At one point, it was learned, he had threatened to kill his wife's entire family with a sawn-off shotgun. In the years after the acquittal of John Peele, Robertson would begin operating a shipping business, which chartered 12 vehicles to Exxon so that they could help clean up after their disastrous oil spill in 1989. One of those ships, the Red Jacket, faced a tragedy of its own when it dropped off 2 crewmen on an island temporarily, but when they came back, they never found the 2 crewmen. This story would make headlines in the early 1990s, ultimately leading to the disclosure of Robertson's true identity. With all of this being said, I am not trying to implicate Robertson at all in this case. However, he was just one of the hundreds of people in Craig, Alaska at the time of the murders. If law enforcement managed to overlook him as a suspect, someone with a history of physical violence, threatening behavior, and arson, and then decided to make him one of their star witnesses, then who else might they have overlooked? Unfortunately, this story has not received any substantial updates in several years. As I mentioned earlier, Alaskan authorities have considered this case closed for decades, dating back to their unsuccessful prosecution of John Peele. While they were unable to prove his guilt, they continue to assert that he was the lone killer of all 8 victims. And as recently as 2017, a spokesman for the Alaska Department of Public Safety would state that the case is closed. However, 8 lives were lost in September of 1982, and to date, no one has been held accountable for that. Despite authorities stating that they continue to believe that Peele was the killer, he was acquitted in a court of law, and years later was paid a settlement by the state of Alaska, proving once and for all that his arrest and detainment were unjustified. What we do know about this tragic and senseless crime is that at least 5 people died aboard the Investor, the ship's owner, Mark Coulthurst, his wife Irene, and daughter Kimberly, as well as 2 of his crewmen, Mike Stewart and Jerome Keown, the latter of whom was only identified through partial dental records. 2 other crewmen, Chris Heyman and Dean Moon, have never been confirmed to have been among the deceased, but it is believed that they too perished aboard the Investor, as did Mark and Irene's 4-year-old son John, whose remains were never found, but were similarly believed to have been consumed by the fire. In recent years, it has been theorized that 4-year-old John Coulthurst might have survived the fire, perhaps being kidnapped by the persons responsible for the murders, but there has been no proof of that in the decades since this happened. A man was seen by multiple witnesses using the Investor's skiff in the days surrounding that murder, September 6th and 7th. This man spoke to several people in Craig during that span, but would disappear into the chaos of the situation, never to be seen again. Despite authorities insisting that this man was John Peele, that has never been proven in a court of law, meaning that officially, he is not guilty of this crime, and no evidence released in the years since his acquittal has changed that, especially since authorities have failed to reconsider their options, and have not been thoroughly investigating this case since the mid-1980s. Until they do, the stories of Mark, Irene, Kimberly, and John Coulthurst, as well as those of Michael Stewart, Jerome Keown, Dean Moon, and Chris Heyman, will remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. In addition to researching and writing almost every episode of the show, I also produce and edit each, and I also compose the music through Amber Music. The song you're hearing right now, however, the Unresolved theme song, was written and composed by my friend, Ailsa Traves. If you would like to follow along with a transcript of each episode, or view my sources or references, please head to the podcast website, unresolved.me. You can also follow along with the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And you can help support this show by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod and pledging as little as $1 a month to receive early commercial-free access to each episode. However, there are also some more exclusive perks, such as Patreon-exclusive mini-episodes, access to my monthly show, Resolved, stickers and magnets, which I will finally be shipping out again soon, don't you guys worry, and now even t-shirts and coffee mugs, which are available only on Patreon. Once again, you could find that by going to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, or by searching for Unresolved in the Patreon app. Now, I would like to take a moment to thank this week's podcast producers, who support the show each month through Patreon. These amazing people are Roberta Jansen, Ben Crocum, Gabriella Bromley, Peggy Bellarda, Quill Carter, Laura Hannon, Damian Moore, Brittany Norris, Amy Hampton, Stephen Wilson, Scott Meesey, Marie Vangland, Scott Patzold, Astrid Nair, Aimee McGregor, Sydney Scotton, Sarah Moscaratolo, Sue Kirk, Travis Sepko, Thomas Ahern, Seth Morgan, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Alyssa Lawton, Joe Wong, Meadow Landry, Rebecca Miller, Tatum Bautista, Tunya Elzinga, Jacinda B., Ryan Green, Stephanie Joyner, and Dawn Keller. Thank you all so friggin' much, and thank you all for listening. It really does mean a lot, and I appreciate all of the support you've all shown me and the show over the past few years. It truly does mean the world to me, so thank you. Now, barring any setbacks, I should be back with another very special episode next week, which will take us back to the East Coast. Anyhow, until then, I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy, and I will talk to you later.